It's about the band The Glorious Sundays, and each chapter contains their album and the release date of said album. So this one is Melodies for Enemies 2011, for example. It's got the album covers, which you can't see it, but there's a ghost in there, and track listings. And then it's got a story, or the essay regards about the making of the album, what the band were doing at the time, and also what my life, what I was doing at the time of the release of that album. So it's a sort of soundtrack to my life. And Tommy Six, the guitarist of the Glorious Sundays, was kind enough to provide a quote. Kent has found a way to engage a history of our band with his own and to make it coherent. A visceral and necessary read, which was very nice to get from the guitarist of the Glorious Sundays. So I'm going to start off with this one. This one is for their 2013 album, Exposition de Misère, which is Misery Exhibition. And it's my favorite Glorious Sundays album. I like the cover art on that one quite a bit, but it's the first one where they had Arnold Tuox on drums, and it's where they kind of came together as a piece. And as you'll hear, it is quite a prominent moment in my life when this album came out. So I'll get started. So there'll be a section about the Glorious Sundays and a section about my life, and back and forth and back and forth. Exposition de Misère is the first The Glorious Sundays album with Onoj Tuox on drums, and it really feels complete. Onoj would go on to join the band, but their work on EDM was initially intended to be as a session drummer, though the vibe caught them and they became a permanent member of TGS, both on tour and in the studio. That's not to say there wasn't tension in the band or drama, but they were working on a creative wavelength none of them had ever experienced before. James Chase would later call EDM the very first time I knew we were going to make it. The vinyl release of EDM came with a bonus cassette of conversations held between the band and the studio. These dialogues contained hints of the dynamics at play within the band, little creative successes and arguments. But listening back, a few things are clear. First, Tommy Six is considering leaving the band at the start of the sessions. Second, James Chase and Ame are hooking up. Third, Onoj Tuox has huge influence despite being considered a session musician. 4, James Chase is not looking after himself, too much coffee, too much alcohol, not enough sleep. And 5, EDM is the reason Tommy stays in the band. So the first time I depersonalized was when I was 12. I was in design technology class. The memory's a blur, but I know looking back that I felt something was wrong. I didn't depersonalize after that for almost a year until I was stood on a balcony in Spain, 13 years old, deciding that I would jump to my death. There was a tent, like a massive food tent below. We were on the 7th or 8th floor, and I was planning to avoid the tent at 13, planning how to kill myself easiest. When Exposition de Misère came out, I was depersonalizing heavy and often. I was working night shifts at the Asda in St. Austell, going through the motions. It felt like I was behind a screen, watching myself perform menial tasks, disconnected from my physical self. The world ceased to exist in the solid, lucid form I had known, and while I assumed it was a side effect of a lifetime of insomnia, it became apparent that it was, in fact, something deeper and more troubling. And I was 4 minutes into a Dictionary of Broken Wings, the song by the Glorious Sundays, during a midnight drive when I decided to kill myself. And then there's some lyrics from a Dictionary of Broken Wings by the Glorious Sundays, and the lyrics are, "This is the path adventure brings, this is the reason the blackbird sings, this is a call for ominous things, this is a dictionary of broken wings." It's never quite been stated why Tommy Six was considering leaving the Glorious Sundays. Some surmised that his reluctance to continue began when the band refused to veer towards the pop sensibilities he was indulging in with his newfound love of the Beatles. This rift between styles would later be quashed in one of the extensive band meetings they had. James Chase was more intrigued by the styling of bands like Bloc Party, whose swirling walls of harmonious noise, whereas Amy Ron had latched onto Young Fathers. The clash of styles is what makes Exposition de Misère so good. It's a symbiotic relationship of genres hammered into a delicate balance. No part sounds too different to be discordant, but they never find themselves beating the same drum. It's in the differences that EDM comes alive, and where the Glorious Sundays produce what is clearly their magnum opus, the masterpiece. And there's a moment about 15 seconds before the end of their song, But Now the Fox, where if you listen closely, you can hear a yelp of excitement from somebody in the studio, a sort of giddy shout of glee. Some critics felt it was intentional. The band chose to record the noise and lay it over the track, but others saw it as a spontaneous burst of in-studio joy. If the official TGS fan site, theglorioussundays.net, is to be believed, then it's Tommy Six declaring his love for the song and the entire project. Tommy Six had a connection with Onage Tuox that became clear during the recording of But Now the Fox. That giddy yelp is Six's uncontrolled excitement of feeling connected to the band again musically. I saw a Matthew Perry film once where he played this guy who smokes weed one night and ends up with depersonalization disorder. The film is Numb. It's directed by a guy called Harris Goldberg. The weed did it. It threw me off for a while because I've never tried drugs. Between the night terrors and depersonalization, I always felt I didn't need an extra hit of surrealism. But Matthew Perry was just a normal guy who developed DPD because of drugs, and that's a real shitty way to look at a mental disorder. Turns out, though, that Harris Goldberg, the director, has DPD, so maybe smoking weed at the wrong time might change some mental faculties and distort reality in a permanent sense. I think my depersonalization disorder came from a lifetime of failing to acknowledge or deal with recurrent abuses. I stayed with Marley for 7 years, even though she was awful and violent and mentally abusive. I bottled up the sexual assault I suffered in the military. I just refused to come to terms with any of these things, instead choosing to let them simmer in a mind that wasn't prepared to turn the heat off. On that night drive, just 2 months shy of leaving Marley for good, I depersonalized bad. The world was unfathomable as a component of reality. Everything had phantasmagoric edges. I was unstable and completely lost somewhere, a couple of feet behind my bones. I was bored and tired of everything, but mostly of being unable to connect with life as a substance. I wanted to feel something regardless of what that something was. And I wanted to come to terms with the reality versus construction debate that raged in my lucid moments. So I decided to drive my car into a wall, a large, thick brick wall that separated the road from an immense drop. A dictionary of broken rings had reached its apex, that whirlwind of guitar that increased in tempo as James Chase sung, "There's a break inside the depth of me, and I don't want to leave here haunted," over and over and over, increasing with the tempo of the song. The runaway train it had become. I knew that by hitting the wall, I would hopefully die and lose the incessant battle against reality that had plagued me. And the idea warmed me. Sure, there was a chance that I'd be left in great pain in hospital, but at least that would demonstrate the solidity of reality. I'd made up my mind. I was going to die, and the Glorious Sundays would soundtrack it. I steered away from the wall at the very last second, skidding back onto the road and spitting out on the tarmac. I gathered myself and drove to the next lay-by, where I parked, turned the engine off, and sobbed. On the side of the road, I cried relentlessly. I thought about myself as a kid, the ugly little pain in the ass I was. I thought about how weak I was, my inability to do anything for myself beyond staying in situations I hated. I hated myself for being annoying, for being that person who has too much energy and goes over the top. I was filled with absolute rage at Aaron Kent, the body and soul of whom I hated passionately. I stepped out of the car and looked at the empty dual carriageway. I couldn't even kill myself properly. I was an utter failure. I was so ashamed of myself that I considered lying in the road at the darkest point and waiting to be run over. And instead, I punched myself in the face hard. And I don't know if you've ever punched yourself, but it isn't as easy as it sounds. The main problem is that you know the punch is coming, so your instincts take over to avoid it at full throttle. That, and it's hard to punch yourself as hard as you probably deserve to be punched. It took a few warm-up punches to build up the momentum to crack myself in the right side of the face with a decent punch. I went back to the car and put EDM on. I listened to the song "A Silence, a Present, a Promise" on repeat until I couldn't absorb it anymore. In Walter Moses, the 13 and a half lives of Captain Blue Bear, there is a gelatinous prince from a different dimension who eats music. I felt like that prince. And some lyrics there. At twilight with low light, I don't need a fist fight. I don't want the street lights, I just want the sweet night. The next day, I watched the Richard Curtis film About Time, and I watched Domhnall Gleeson discover that time travel means his children will end up being different children by going back and forth. By altering the past, his kids were not the kids he knew. I watched the desperation of his attempt to revert his error and the joy upon succeeding and holding his kids again. I knew I wanted children, and I wanted a love that wasn't sworn in by violence. I knew Marley was far removed from these aspirations, and I had to be courageous for the first time. Just a couple of weeks after breaking up with Marley, I went to a Halloween party. I was dressed as a monkey, and I won several games of beer pong. The host had the Glorious Sundays on his party mixtape, but only the classics. After the party ended, just before midnight, several people decided to go into Truro to grab some food and head to the clubs. On the way into the city centre, a friend asked if I wanted to get a beef burger, and I told him I didn't, as I was a vegetarian. Behind me, a tipsy zombie shouted, "No way, I'm vegetarian too, and my mum's a lesbian." We chatted the whole way to Vanilla. Vanilla's a Cornish nightclub in Truro. I'd never been before meeting Emma. I didn't end up going in that night either. My younger brother had been kicked out as I was queued up to go in, so I got him home and crashed into bed. This girl's name was Emma, and I was captivated by her. We got married within 3.5 years and had 2 children by 2020. It's odd to think that had I hit that wall, none of this would have happened. I had made plans, packed stuff away, written a note, cleaned myself up, trimmed my beard, and left everything in a reasonable condition for whatever came after my death. But it turns out what to come was a complete reversal.